Welcome, Dr. Muecke. It's so good to have you at the Nutrition Academy and to learn all that you have learned since your graduation in 1987 from medical school. My first question to you is, why did you decide to do medicine?
It's a really good question because I often thought about this. Is there anything that drove me down the pathway of medicine? Not really. You know, my father wasn't a medical doctor. There was nothing specific in my childhood that made me want to do medicine. I think just a desire to want to help people. I also loved using my hands, particularly in those around the age of 8, 9, 10, 11, I used to build models, World War II model airplanes and tanks and things like that. So I used to love using my hands. So the idea of surgery, and particularly microsurgery, was really interesting to me. And I also had a love affair with Africa. I used to watch all these programs as a child about Africa. So I had this fascination with Africa. So the idea of using surgery to help people, and particularly in Africa, was something that was really appealing. And sort of my pathway then headed down that direction. So, but yeah, there was nothing specific, just the way it was. And I still remember back when I was 11 years of age, we were living in the United States for a couple of years. Dad was working with the Australian Embassy. Coming back through Hawaii, and we stopped off for a few days of R&R, and there was this little souvenir shop in Honolulu, and there was a statue. There were, in fact, a number of statues, and this one statue was the god of wisdom, Hakuna. And on the back of the statue, it said that the god of wisdom helps children get through difficult studies, and particularly kids who are interested in getting into medicine. So I pleaded for mum and dad to buy the statue for me. And so it was interesting, even at the age of 11, I knew I wanted to do medicine. So it allowed me to really focus through high school to get into medicine. And that little statue sat on my bookshelf looking over me through high school and then through medical school. And so it's interesting that I had that desire to do medicine from very early on.
That is incredible. I always find there's a defining moment. Somebody suggests something or says something, and it almost sounds like that statue was maybe your defining moment. So moving from when you graduated from medicine, and I have lots of friends that have graduated, and I've watched them go through their intern years, and then they decide to specialise. So why did you decide to specialise in the eye? Was it when you were going through medical school, or was it when you went to Africa to work?
Yeah, it was actually it was a bit of a combination of all of those things. So through medical school, at the end of my 5th year, I did a medical elective in Africa. So that was my first opportunity to go to Africa and work as a young medical student, as a volunteer medical student. But while I was in Africa, I came across this little hospital in the mountains of central Kenya, a place called Tumu Hospital. There was a couple of Aussie medical students who were doing their elective there. So I went and visited them. I didn't do my elective there. I did it in the capital city at Kenyatta National Hospital. But I fell in love with this place. I thought one day, gee, it'd be great to come back and work here. So through my internship, which was my first year of work and first year of earning money, I was becoming a little disillusioned. You know, it was a pretty intense year in itself. You know, we had these 34-hour shifts back then, and it was just full on, relentless, and on the back of, you know, really 12 years of high school and medical school of studying. And I studied really, really hard. Excuse me, really, really hard. I just needed a break. I was also becoming a little disillusioned with medicine because this was my first year of practicing medicine as an intern, and I was mainly just seeing patients who had chronic diseases, often self-inflicted, and diseases particularly caused by smoking back then, and we were starting to see dietary diseases growing. And so I just wanted to do something different. So through my internship, I wrote to the director of the hospital, the Tumu Hospital, that I'd come across during my medical elective in medical school, and I asked him if I could come and work for a year after my internship had finished, and he welcomed me, and so I headed back to Kenya to work as a voluntary doctor for a year. I saved my entire internship to work as a volunteer there. So that on one hand reinvigorated love of medicine. On the other, it instilled in me a desire to pursue a career in public health. But then if I combine that love of working in poorer communities, public health, using my hands, and also most particularly interested, as I mentioned before, in doing microsurgery. And so ophthalmology, it was something that I'd had a little taste of in medical school, not a lot, but it just was something that I thought, wow, that would be fantastic. And then be able to cure blindness. And back then I was very focused. As I mentioned that I was coming out of my internship where, chronic diseases, highly preventable diseases were so prevalent, but I just didn't get it then. And then I went to Africa and suddenly, I was able to cure people, which was really a fabulous thing. I loved it, suited my personality. And then so to be able to cure blindness using my hand and using microsurgery, all of these things came together at once to make that decision to do ophthalmology, the thing that I wanted to do. And it was interesting because before I left, in fact, through my internship, I was trying to decide what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to do surgery. In fact, I was quite keen to do neurosurgery. That was one of the other things that was very interesting to me, the very fine surgery of neurosurgery. And everyone I spoke to through that year who I approached about, doing a specialty, but, if I left Adelaide, if I went to Africa and just spent a year, would it affect my chances of getting into that particular specialty? And time again, I was hearing, oh, if you leave, you'll never get back into the system. Don't do it. I was constantly getting discouraged. Then I went to visit the director of the eye department at the Royal Adelaide Hospital. And I said, oh, I'm really interested in ophthalmology, but I just need to have a year off. I need a break. I need to do something different. And I explained why. And he was very, very enthusiastic, very embracing, and actually encouraged me to do it. And so I went off to Africa, kind of comfortable in the knowledge that perhaps ophthalmology was the thing for me and that he would welcome me back into the fold. And sure enough, during my year, I actually got a phone call from him. I was actually in the operating theatre at the time, this little hospital, and he offered me a training job. So I returned from Africa and started my training as ophthalmology. So that's, in a big nutshell, how it happened.
So while you were in Africa then, in that it was a 12-month period in Africa, so is that where you started to think about food, think about diet as because of what they eat, or was there anything there that you saw?
Absolutely not. No. In fact, the whole diet thing is very, very recent. It's really just this year. But there in Africa at that time, coming out of my internship, coming out of this chronic disease, preventable health disaster really due to smoking, and then just having that joy of being able to cure patients who have mainly infectious diseases. We were seeing a bit of trauma, so there was the opportunity to operate. I was doing quite a bit of obstetrics and which was wonderful. O&G was another thing I was quite interested in doing. And so I was doing cesarean sections and again, doing surgery. So that was joyful. And then the other thing that we were seeing a lot of was infectious diseases, so malaria, tuberculosis. And so we were able to cure people. Infectious diseases are usually imminently curable. And I was able to cure people for the first time. And it was just such a powerful thing. It really was just so inspiring and to be able to, have an impact, really. So that was the thing that just was center in my mind at the time. And came back, I finished my ophthalmology training. And then as soon as I finished training, I wanted to head back into the wilderness again. And I actually went and worked in the Middle East, in Jerusalem, at an eye hospital called St. John's, run by St. John's. And again, this was fantastic for me because I was able to hone my microsurgical craft, particularly cataract surgery, which is the leading cause of blindness in the world. And so this was again the ability to cure people and cure people of a blinding disease, which is imminently treatable and it was again very inspiring. So for me, right through those years, it was all about having results and being able to help people, as suited my personality, as I mentioned before. It wasn't until 2007. Now, I say it wasn't until 2007. Being a doctor, I'm fully aware of the power of prevention, but I think it really hit home in 2007. I was back in Australia had been back since about 1998, working as a consultant ophthalmologist in private, but also at the Women's and Children's Hospital and the Royal Adelaide Hospital. I actually am an eye cancer specialist. So I was starting to work and subspecialise in this area as well, which was fascinating. And it was also wanting to continue to be involved in projects in poorer communities, and particularly research and educational projects that I became involved in, which is really the reason why Sight for All came to be. So in 2007, I was involved in a childhood blindness study in Myanmar in Southeast Asia. And this was an extraordinary, excuse the pun, eye-opening experience. The aim of the study was to determine the causes of blindness amongst children in schools for the blind across the country. So we travelled the length and breadth of the country, assessing kids who are blind in schools for the blind. And the results were extraordinary. We found that nearly half of the kids had blindness that could have been prevented or treated. So that in itself was pretty confronting. The thing that really had the impact on me was the leading cause of blindness that we discovered, and that was measles. So here was a bunch of children, a leading cause of blindness in this country, a highly preventable cause of blindness in measles. But not only the knowledge that it was a highly preventable cause of blindness, but to be surrounded by children who were horribly disfigured and irreversibly blind from measles, when for less than $1 they could have not been in that situation. You know, it was just one of the most powerful experiences of my medical life. And it really made me realize that there's so much more to blindness than just cataracts and just curing blindness using surgery. And it really drove home how powerful prevention is in medicine. The other thing that I saw, and in fact, we found that measles was a leading cause of blindness in 2 other countries that we were working in, where we performed studies. So in Cambodia and Laos, we also found that measles was a major cause of blindness. So it is a sign of a very poor country. And so even in these 3 countries, we were also coming across kids who were poorly sighted, even blind because they'd never been tested for spectacles, because there was simply no one available, or very few people available in their countries to be able to provide a pair of spectacles, something that we take for granted here. So again, another preventable, highly preventable cause of vision loss and blindness. So, you know, these were things that really started to turn my thinking and it was so formative, that experience, that I started then really focusing on how we can prevent blindness as well as treat blindness in poor communities. So in poor countries, something like 80% of blindness is preventable or treatable. Cataract being the leading cause, but you can see how some readily preventable causes such as measles or a lack of spectacles was also very prevalent as well. So I started to think about how I could actually make an impact on that. And just one example I can give you on the back of that experience in Myanmar. I actually returned and I met with the health minister, and I laid the publication of that study down on his lap, and he had a look at the abstract and looked up at me and said, "Oh, I thought we were doing better than that." Clearly not. So what that allowed me to do, and ultimately us to do as Sight for All, and this was really the beginnings of Sight for All as an organisation, was to persuade the health minister and my colleagues over there, who were just so focused on cataract blindness. You know, we have an opportunity to fight childhood blindness here. So let's train a children's eye specialist for the country. And so we brought a young eye specialist from Myanmar to Adelaide to train as a paediatric ophthalmologist, children's eye specialist at the Women's and Children's Hospital with myself and my colleagues. So he had a hands-on year of training, went home at the end of 2010 as the very first children's eye specialist for his country. We set him up in the country's first children's eye unit with all the equipment that he needed. And wow, did he have an impact. So that was 10 years ago. So 10 years later, he's now providing close to 30,000 treatments to kids every year. Just him alone. Super impressive. But the thing that really, he then, his confidence and competence grew steadily. In 2005, started training the second paediatric ophthalmologist for the country, and he now trains at least 2 every year. So it's this sustainability, the scalability, the teach a man to fish strategy is just having such an enormous impact throughout Asia. In fact, we've now trained paediatric ophthalmologists from 9 countries, and in fact, we've trained colleagues in all the various subspecialty areas of our profession and impacting on about 1 million people or more every year. So it's that's in a nutshell the Sight for All story.
Well, I think I want people to go to the Sight for All, which you started in 2008, because I read through it and I was just blown away by what you are doing. And I now understand why you made Australian of the Year in 2020, as well as the Order of Australia in 2012, AMA President's Leadership in 2013, Ernst & Young, I'm not sure exactly what Ernst & Young did, but it was 2015. And now, you know, to become Australian of the Year. And when I read about you, and I read about you in the Australian, and I usually buy the Australian for the crossword, never read it. But I flipped over the back where the crossword usually is, and there was a whole thing on life, and it was all about saturated fat. And your name was in amongst it all. And so I thought, oh, I've got to find out who this man is and what he's done. And so I guess what I want to know is where you've come from, Sight for All, to doing this leap where you're Australian of the Year. And what I read was, I want to change the dietary guidelines. Then when I spoke to you and you said, oh, that's just part of what I want to do. Can you explain to me, how can we do this? Do you think this is possible? I've been in this for 40 years. I graduated from Deakin University and the University of Colorado back in the 80s, before you graduated from medical school. And I just kind of go, how are we going to do this? It's so ingrained in the DAA. The AMA seem to be quite happy with it. The Australian government, Greg Hunt doesn't seem to be changing, but I do know that you have an ear with Greg Hunt. So let me know. What are we going to do?
Well, we can spend the rest of the podcast chatting about this, actually, and pull me up at any time, because I could rattle on for hours about this.
Go for it.
So, no, I started my training in ophthalmology 30 years ago to this year, actually. And so for 30 years, I've been dealing with the consequences that diabetes inflicts on the eyes, type 1 and type 2 diabetes. And every year, I was seeing more and more patients who are losing vision due to their diabetes, particularly type 2, which makes up close to 90% of cases. And you know, I'm guilty as charged. I was really just dealing with the end-stage consequences of this disease, the complications, the blinding complications. Blindness is the most feared complication of diabetes. And here I was just dealing with those consequences, not giving a thought to what the root cause of the major of type 2 diabetes was, which really is sugar and refined carbohydrates to excess in our diet. But I think the turning point for me, it was a bit like that study in Myanmar I mentioned. The turning point for me was in 2018, I met a man, actually. It wasn't so much a patient as a subject for a documentary series that I was filming about the experience of blindness, what it means to go blind, to lose vision. And I interviewed 10 people, 4 kids who were born blind, 4 elderly people who are slowly losing vision at the end of their life, and 2 that suddenly went blind in the middle of their life, and both of those had diabetes. And I wasn't expecting, but this man, his name was Neil Hansel, and he's more than happy for me to use his name. His story was just so extraordinarily powerful, and we spent an hour and a half interviewing him. And by the end of the conversation, he was in tears. His wife, who was in the other room listening in, was in tears. I was in tears. The film director was in tears. The sound engineer, we just had tears pouring down our face. It was just devastating, his story. And I think the climax came when he said, you know, I asked him what was the last thing that he saw when he went blind. And he said, how did he go blind, actually? He actually woke up one morning blind in both eyes. So he went to bed the night before with normal sight. Next morning, blind in both eyes. What was the last thing he saw? he talks about his wife's beautiful face and, you know, with tears streaming down his eyes. And that moment, actually, we used to create a 30-second TV commercial about make sure you get your eyes checked if you have diabetes. So I'll just step away slightly from that. So diabetes is the leading cause of blindness amongst working age adults. And it is so because well over half of the patients with diabetes are not having their regular eye checks. And so they're leaving it till too late. And like Neil, you know, putting their eyesight at risk. And unfortunately, his disease was so advanced, although he wasn't aware of it, but it couldn't be retrieved by surgery. So he's still blind to this day. So that story was so incredibly powerful that firstly, I created that TV commercial for Sight for All. It played nationally on Channel 7 for about 6 weeks in late 2018, but it played as a community service announcement. So 2 o'clock in the morning, probably didn't get a lot of views. Very frustrating. I tried hard to have it funded to play during prime time across multiple channels and for extended periods, but it was prohibitively expensive and I wasn't able to get funding from pharmaceutical companies. I tried everywhere, and so it just sat there, and we used a bit on social media, but it was a really powerful moment, and I then started to think more about it, and the following year, so almost to the year, I was nominated and happened to win the South Australian Award for Australian of the Year. So I got up and made my speech, and it was all about, you know, making sure we raise awareness of the fact that diabetes is such a major cause of blindness in our society. So then moving forward to Australia Day weekend this year, I started to think more deeply about it. And I thought, don't I have a, you know, if I do happen to win the national award, which I really wasn't expecting to win. I didn't think they were going to give it to another Adelaide doctor again. Richard Harris, of course, won it last year, and he was a medical school colleague of mine. We were in the same year, actually. But he won it for his cave diving heroics in Thailand, of course. But I didn't think they would give it to another doctor from Adelaide. Anyway, I thought that if I do, I better be prepared, and I started thinking deeply about, well, yeah, I've got a responsibility here to actually address the root cause of the major underlying scenario with type 2 diabetes, which is our poor diet, essentially. And so did a lot of reading, a lot of thinking, and came up with a bit of a strategy that I could talk about if I won the award. And so I came up with this strategy I called the 5 A's of sugar toxicity. I don't know if you've heard about it or read about it, but it was just a way for me to think about it. And so just briefly for the listeners, so first A, addiction. You know, sugar is highly addictive. As addictive as nicotine, we use it to alleviate, we use it, yeah. The second A is alleviation. So we often use sugar to alleviate stress when we're down, make us feel better. Third A is accessibility. Sugar is cheap and literally everywhere in our lives these days. Fourth A is addition. 75% of food and drinks have added sugar. Fifth A is advertising. So our world is flooded with ads, TV commercials for sugary products. So these 5 A's allowed me to think about it in a more strategic way. And then it also allowed me to think about, okay, well, how can we address each of these A's? And then there was an overarching 3 more A's, which came after that, one of which was awareness, you know, being personally aware that sugar is highly addictive and we use it to alleviate stress, being aware that there's so much added sugar in our diet. Then the second A was accountability, and particularly accountability for the third 3 A's, addition, accessibility, and advertising, and particularly accountability of businesses as an industry to do the right thing by the people of Australia. And then the third A, overarching A, was action, and action by our government to raise awareness and to hold business and industry accountable. So this 8 A's really became, you know, my mantra for the year. And that's, if we want to talk about the various A's, and this is a systemic problem. Mm-hmm. And when I won the award, I talked about a number of strategies, and of course I was in Canberra, and there was political journalists, and they were all talking about Dr. Muecke calls for a sugar tax and rah, rah, rah. And it all became about the sugar tax. And I was saying, no, it's not just about the sugar tax. That's just one thing. There's all of these things that we need to address. It's just a systemic change. We need a paradigm shift. And so we'll go through those A's very briefly. So you know, as I said before, with the addiction alleviations, about the awareness. And you know, if you're aware, I wasn't aware as a doctor how addictive sugar was until about a year ago, until I started doing my reading. When you're aware that it's addictive, you can then start to put in place strategies to detox from sugar. If you're aware you're using it to alleviate stress, you can put strategies in to have alternative, healthier options, which trigger the reward center in our brain. So when we're stressed, the body is flooded with cortisol, and you need to balance that up by triggering feel-good chemicals such as dopamine. And so sugar does a really good job of that. But there are much healthier options, such as, you know, literally going for a walk out in nature somewhere beautiful, listening to your favorite music, doing a good deed for someone else. These have all been shown to be as effective as sugar in countering that cortisol reaction that's flooding our body during anxious times. And so then the other three A's, so accessibility, there's some obvious ones. I mean, there's lots of strategies that you can use, but quite simply removing all the sugary products from vending machines. We have vending machines in the Women's and Children's Hospital here in Adelaide, and in the Adelaide Medical and Dental School of Adelaide University, packed to the brim with sugary products. And I've written to both the Children's Hospital and the Adelaide University asking them to remove those sugary products. Of course, also, sorry?
How's that going?
At this stage, no action. And in fact, I'm going to get back on the emails probably today to write to them saying, you know, how's it going? Just keep in their faces.
My students need to help. Perhaps if we put an email out to the students and get them to also send it to the Adelaide Hospital that live in the South Australian area. Like, to me, it's power in numbers, isn't it? And as you're talking, I keep thinking, are you not scared that you're going to end up like Gary Fedke, gagged for 3 years by APRA? Is it not come into mind what happened to him might happen to you, that the DAA is not going to be happy with you, they're going to report you to APRA and then you'll be gagged? Do you worry about that, or do you think that that's over and done with and poor Gary was the scapegoat?
Yeah, poor Gary was the scapegoat, and Gary, as you know, had a 2.5-year Star Chamber investigation and was eventually cleared by our medical board, APRA. And as a result of that, doctors can give nutritional advice, dietary advice, as long as it's evidence-based. So, you know, it's an interesting thing. You know, people often say, "Oh, you know, poor Gary was struck off by talking out." Dr. Muecke wins Australian of the Year, but actually, as I said, as you're aware, I didn't win Australian of the Year because of my what I'm talking about at the moment. I actually won it because of the work with Sight for All, but I'm using this platform.
Well done.
So we'll come back to the Gary Fedke story because that's really interesting. But just so the other thing I think was the just going back through those final 3 A's very quickly, was the predatory action of businesses and particularly supermarkets and stores, where you have those sugary food and drinks at checkouts, often heavily discounted, where they're preying on people's addictions, preying on the vulnerable, preying on our kids. And when you're addicted to something, we need to protect the environment of people who are addicted. So moving products away from checkouts is just one of a number of strategies. Coming to the addition A, you know, having a clear and transparent labelling system so that people are aware of the added sugar content in food and drinks is important. And this fourth A is also where the levy on sugary products would come in, but there's certainly some solid evidence and good reasoning behind it. You know, there was a big study in 2017, and the 10 years leading up to 2017, there's been an increase of 30% in the sugary drinks that we consume. if we just look at sugary drinks, there's been a number of studies showing that sugary drinks are linked to type 2 diabetes, and a number of studies showing that a levy on sugary drinks will reduce consumption. And it's been modelled in Australia. If we place a 20% levy on sugary drinks, it will raise over $600 million, which could be used to fund those awareness strategies that I mentioned, or to fund health inequalities that exist in our society. So it certainly makes sense to me. And the final A was advertising. So an obvious one is to take TV commercials, which are specifically aimed at kids, from those hours where our kids are watching TV. So just a few of the many strategies that need to be put in place to create this systemic change. But you mentioned the dietary guidelines, and you mentioned the Gary Fettke story. So Gary was an orthopedic surgeon, and several years ago was just becoming weary of every week amputating legs from patients with type 2 diabetes due to gangrene. So loss of limb is the second most feared complication of diabetes after loss of vision. So Gary started saying, he, like me, started doing a reading about it, and I only met Gary after I won the award earlier in the year, and learned about his story. So independently, I was doing the same thing. I was starting to think, okay, finally, I'm getting it. And finally, we need to communicate to our patients the dangers of the diet. And so Gary started just telling his patients to cut back on their sugar. It was reported by one of the dietitians at his hospital in Launceston in Tasmania, and was hauled up in front of our medical board and had that investigation for 2.5 years. Devastating impact on his personal life, his career. Finally got cleared, and Gary has been a huge advocate for this ever since. And Gary and his wife Belinda, who have just been hugely influential and hugely powerful in communicating this message, and been an amazing mentors to me through this process, which has been, I didn't realize when I went down this pathway quite how insidious it is and how disturbing it is. And Gary's story just opened my eyes to what goes on here. Extraordinary. So yeah, moving on to the dietary guidelines, and how did that happen? Well, I was actually invited to be an ambassador for the Open Your World initiative of Wellbeing SA, so our local Department of Health. And I thought, oh, that's nice, love to. And when their website was released middle of the year, I thought, well, I'll go and have a look and check out the Eating Well section. And I looked at the Eating Well section and I thought, goodness me, there's all this stuff which, as far as I was aware, was not eating well. The dietary advice that was being given in this website was not healthy dietary advice that I'd learned through all my readings. So I wrote to SA Health and I said, I'm concerned about what you're promoting here. I don't believe it's healthy, and the current evidence doesn't support this. And they kind of defended it and then referred me to the National Health and Medical Research Council. So I then wrote to the NHMRC and I met with the NHMRC and I said, are you aware that all of this is contrary to current scientific evidence? And so it really unfolded from there. And I realized that actually all of this dietary advice is based on our Australian dietary guidelines. And the Australian dietary guidelines informed the Open Your World initiative. It informed the food pyramid. It informs the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating for mainstream Australians, for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, for elderly, for kids. And it's actually really powerful. Someone said to me recently, oh, I didn't even realize we had dietary guidelines. But they're really powerful. They actually inform what's eaten in schools, prisons, the Defence Force, hospitals, aged care, childcare. They also inform our army of health providers, health educators, such as your team, and also health policymakers. And they also inform the health industry as a result of the guidelines, and particularly the demonisation of natural saturated fats, We have had literally thousands of low-fat products that have been created. And since the first guidelines, which were released in Australia back in, I think it was 1982, what we've seen, actually worldwide, we've seen this huge growth of type 2 diabetes, something like fourfold globally, a growth in type 2 diabetes since the release of the American dietary guidelines in 1980, which recommended to reduce our fat to 30% and increase our carbs to compensate to 60%. And this was based on no scientific evidence whatsoever. It was actually noted in the decades after World War II, a rise in heart attacks. And it was presumed that the heart attacks were due to a fatty diet causing fatty blockage of our coronary arteries. And so on no scientific evidence, the recommendations was made. And these dietary guidelines were hugely influential. They moved all over the world, and including Australia. They were brought to Australia and formed the basis of our dietary guidelines. And still to this day, there is a discouragement of the ingestion of natural saturated fats in our diet. And yet there's no evidence to suggest that the natural saturated fats in our diet are linked to cardiovascular disease. So things like avocado, olive oil, nuts, but not just those, what people understand as healthy fats, but also the natural saturated fats that are found in unprocessed meat, full fat dairy, eggs, even dark chocolate, never been linked to cardiovascular disease. This is such critical information the Australian people are unaware of, and yet our guidelines continue to discourage the eating of these products. So our current dietary guidelines are carbohydrate heavy, so something like 2/3 are carbs. And if you look at the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating, which is a pictorial representation of our guidelines, 2/3 are plant-based, and particular weight towards cereals and grains. And particularly, this is the thing that disturbed me, particularly the refined carbohydrates. So the products such as white rice, white flour, white potatoes, and the foods made from them. The Australian Guide to Healthy Eating is covered in a variety of white breads and pastas. It also has products which are processed and quite often which are high in sugar as well. And I'm thinking, why is our Australian Guide to Healthy Eating having all of these products in them? Sugar and carbs, and particularly refined carbs, are non-essential. There's not a single biochemical process in our body that demands that we ingest sugar and carbohydrates. So, this was the sort of conversations I was having and started to think about and started to talk about with people like Gary Fettke. And, I just kept on writing back to the NHMRC saying, this is all wrong. We need to change this. And then I wrote an opinion piece for the Canberra Times, which came out in a couple of months ago, I think, saying our dietary guidelines, need to be reviewed. They're flawed and they're conflicted by industry. And Greg Hunt then subsequently came out and said the dietary guidelines are going to be reviewed. So, it's quite a proud moment for me. I thought, gee, if I have one impact this year, then this is the impact that hopefully I will have. But I made the comment in that opinion piece that our guidelines are heavily flawed and the authors of the guidelines are conflicted by industry. And I didn't really justify that in that piece. And I'm actually going to write another piece to really explain why that is the case. Because in my investigation of, why are we still demonizing natural saturated fats? Why are we celebrating carbs and particularly refined carbs, which are really, I believe, driving our poor health? And if you look deeper at it and how this potentially could have arisen, and you mentioned the DAA, the Dietitians Association of Australia, who are now called Dietitians Australia. They were very much a part of the dietary guideline process, and particularly the Australian dietary guidelines from 2013. And there's a long history, 100-year-old history in that as well. But if we just look at the 2013 dietary guidelines, there's a comment in there about the fact that the evidence for saturated fats, natural saturated fats in our diet hasn't changed since the 2003 dietary guidelines. So we don't need to look at that again. But that's wrong, because actually there's a lot of evidence through that period saying, supporting the fact that natural saturated fats are not linked to cardiovascular disease. So, it was guilty before it was even had a chance to be reassessed. So they just continued 20 years later demonizing natural saturated fats. But then if you look at the literature review, so the literature review, the references which inform the dietary guidelines, that whole process was undertaken by the DAA. And the questions that guided the literature review, but if we just look at, let's say, the cereal and grain section, the references for the 2013 dietary guidelines, 63 out of the 73 references in this section were industry funded. And so we know that when industry funds a study, it's 8 times more likely to show a result that favours that industry. So here we have references for an entire section of our dietary guidelines, which is heavily influenced by industry. And at the time, the DAA were heavily conflicted by industry as well. There were huge conflicts of interest, which were linkages between DAA members and the working group back to industry. So how could that not have had an influence on this process? But there were also a couple of very interesting questions which guided the literature review. In the meat section, the one question was, look for references linking meat to cancer. Mm. Not look for look for references which explore the health benefits or the health concerns regarding meat. It was actually look for references that meat causes cancer. And the other one in the cereals question, the one question, cereal and grain section, was look for the health benefits of cereals, not the dangers of excessive cereal and grain consumption. So this is a classic case of strategic deception. Continuing
deception.
Yeah, continuing to perpetuate this demonization of natural saturated fats, and particularly unprocessed meat, particularly red meat, and to continue to celebrate grains and cereals. And you can see when there was huge industry influence, particularly by processed food industry in the creation of those guidelines and the references, you can see how this has all happened. And as I said, there's a lot more history to it, but yeah.
Belinda, I've had Belinda, we do a summit every year, and this year Belinda was to speak, Belinda Fedke, and she has that incredible history. And most of my nutrition students do know that because I have interviewed Belinda for this. What we are finding is that industry is a huge part of our dietary guidelines. And I see somebody like you with a high profile that might be able to break the back of what is happening at the moment and maybe start, a change in what we're doing. How much hope do you hold that in your year as Australian of the Year and your influence maybe with Greg Hunt, our health minister, because I know we couldn't do a interview a couple of weeks ago because you're having a meeting with Greg Hunt. How hopeful are you that we are going to do this, or you're going to be able to do this?
If we look at tobacco smoking and the huge backlash, I suppose, by the tobacco industry when the health concerns for tobacco and cigarette smoking arose back in the 60s. It's taken decades for that to change. And that's just one product. Here, with sugar, we have huge number of industries that are involved in this. We have the beverages, we have the processed food industries, we have the sugarcane farmers in Queensland and northern New South Wales. So there's so much, and this is such a complicated area, and so much industry depends on it, that the government, are very hesitant to actually, really take it on in this systemic way that needs to be done. So I did, as you mentioned, had a meeting with Greg Hunt a couple of weeks ago. And he was very interested, and I hit him some pretty hard-hitting facts about type 2 diabetes particularly. We have an epidemic of type 2 diabetes. We have an obesity epidemic. We have a dental caries tooth decay epidemic as well. And the cost to our society and to the taxpayer is astronomical. It's, again, we could talk about this for hours, and the complications of type 2 diabetes, the devastating complications. We just touched on amputation and loss of vision, but this is a disease that ravages the entire body. So I had a really good meeting with him, and he actually met Neil Hansel as well, and Neil was a huge advocate, huge ambassador for this process. And at the end, Greg, he said that I'm really going to take this on, and we're really going to look at the preventability and also the reversibility of type 2 diabetes. So he vowed at the end, and he signed something in front of me saying that we're going to do this. He said there's some things I can't do. He didn't allude to which it could be, that I realised that there are things that are pretty tough. And one of the things, in fact, when I received the award back in January, literally that week, Greg Hunt came out saying that a tax on sugar, excuse me, a tax on sugary products is off the table. So I realised that the government, and in fact neither of the major parties, are wanting to address that, because it means it's a huge revenue spinner. It's jobs, and it's also votes in marginal seats in northern Queensland where the sugarcane areas are. So a difficult thing for either party to take on. So it's going to take a brave health minister, a brave government to want to tackle this. But it can be done, and it should be done, because this is a disease that's only growing. There's something like 1.7 million with type 2 diabetes, and there's 2 million with pre-diabetes who, over the next decade or so, will go on to develop type 2 diabetes if we don't do something about it. It's a real worry. So I'm an eternally positive, optimistic sort of person. I think the fact that the guidelines are going to be reviewed, and what we need to do with the guidelines is to ensure that it's fair and independent. We need to ensure that the conflicted bodies aren't the lead authors or the lead, let's say the lead, take a lead in the process. We need people who are not conflicted, or bodies that are not conflicted, to be driving this. So how does one do that? How does one do impartial analysis of biased literature? It's a really difficult thing to do. And one thing that I raised with Greg Hunt, and actually with the Department of Health and the NHMRC, why don't we actually scrap the dietary guidelines? Because dietary guidelines, we shouldn't need guidelines for healthy people. But what's interesting is that the majority of Australians are not healthy. Over 2/3 of Australian adults over the age of 24 are overweight or obese, and around about 1/3 of kids are as well. So the majority of Australians are not metabolically healthy. So we actually need guidelines for people who are not healthy. So we need guidelines for people who are insulin resistant, who have pre-diabetes, who have type 2 diabetes. So we're better off spending that $2 million that's been given to review the guidelines, put it into targeted guidelines for people who have these metabolic disorders. And so whether I can keep pushing for that, and what the review process will entail, and whether we'll have an independent and fair process is yet to be seen. But I'm certainly going to continue pushing for the inclusion of the latest evidence, and particularly the evidence around natural saturated fats. And so hopefully that process can unfold. The other thing which I find really quite interesting is that I'm now a member of the expert advisory group for the National Diabetes Strategy Refresh. So the last review is in 2016. So I was invited this year to be on the advisory group for the refresh. And they're probably cursing me now because there's no mention in that document about reversibility of type 2 diabetes. And I was the only one of that group to actually mention it at the meeting. There is now 3 strategies that we can actually potentially reverse type 2 diabetes, or at least put it into remission. People sometimes prefer to use that term. There are 3 methods, evidence-based methods. There's something called bariatric surgery, which involves major abdominal surgery, chopping out bits and rearranging bits of the digestive system, which entails high risk, it entails significant expense, and it also entails a lifelong dependency on nutritional supplementation. So it's, this to me would be a last line, but it has been proven to work. So that's something that could be potentially offered to patients. But there are 2 dietary methods for reversing or putting diabetes into remission, type 2 diabetes, one of which is a very low calorie diet, an 800 calorie per day diet, has been proven to work through the direct study out of the UK. But again, it's pretty much a starvation diet, a hunger diet, which also makes people reliant on processed foods and a lifelong dependency on nutritional supplementation, because this is not ultimately a healthy diet, and it's also draws on a lifelong need for willpower. So, I'm not a big advocate of that type of diet, but again, it's been shown to work. So perhaps that should be offered to patients. And the third thing is a low carbohydrate diet. And then now over 100 controlled clinical trials to show that a low carb diet actually works to put type 2 diabetes in remission. A low carb diet, our dietary guidelines are high carb. They encourage eating of carbohydrates. There's no studies to show that a high carb diet can reverse type 2 diabetes. So why is this the diet that we have? And why are the diabetes associations recommending that we follow this high carb diet when it doesn't actually work? It's the very thing that people with diabetes shouldn't be eating. So a low carb diet has been shown to work. And so I'm pushing in the expert advisory group for the National Diabetes Strategy Rethink to have this included as a major goal. But I'm getting some resistance. It's extraordinary. Why? Should this not be shouted from the rooftops? Are we not being negligent as a medical profession, even as a health profession, as health educators, not to raise this with every single patient with type 2 diabetes that comes into our office?
Why do you think the resistance is there? Who are the other people on the advisory board that have resistance? Are they industry? Are they other doctors? I don't understand. Why would there be resistance when, there are studies, it's evidence-based, that a low calorie as well as a keto diet or a low carbohydrate diet is going to work. Prove that the keto diet will help kids with number 1, brain tumours, number 1, seizures. Where is this resistance coming from?
Yeah, so I think there's probably a number of reasons for that. One of which is that for 40, 50 years, we've got it wrong. And we as a profession don't want to admit we've got it wrong. I think that is a big part of it. And then also we have industry influence, vested interest, conflicts of interest, whatever you want to call them. And we know that, sadly, there are scientists, nutritional scientists, who are conflicted. We know that there are health practitioners, physicians who are conflicted. And if we look, just as an example of that, if we look at, there was a study, a very interesting study looking at the links between sugar-sweetened beverages, what the industry calls sugar-sweetened beverages, I call sugar-loaded beverages, between sugar-loaded beverages and type 2 diabetes. And they looked at the studies which were funded by industry, and they looked at the studies which weren't funded by industry. The non-industry funded studies, 33 out of the 34, showed that there was a link between sugar-loaded beverages and type 2 diabetes. Of the 26 studies which were funded by industry, none of them showed a link. So you can see when industries fund, it just completely conflicts. And so if you have scientists, and sometimes eminent scientists, and sometimes eminent physicians who are being funded, and in Australia, sadly, a lot of our research is not funded by government. So it has to be funded by industry. And that immediately puts a huge conflict and put a huge, for me, question mark on the legitimacy of that study, that reference, and potentially also some of the authors on that study. So it worries me a lot. So, I'm not pointing any fingers, but I think there is huge influences that are at play here.
Yeah. My husband and I took 3 weeks off and we went north in Queensland. And as we're going through the cane fields, I kept saying to my husband, does the world need this much sugar? Like, I was blown away by the amount of cane that was being grown. And I just thought even the world wouldn't need this much sugar that we're growing, here in Australia, let alone everywhere else around the world that grows sugar. The other...
Can I just on that note, actually, sorry to interrupt. It's been modeled. In fact, in a number of countries, there's been no loss of jobs when a levy has been placed on sugary drinks. In a number of countries, and it's been modelled here in Australia that it's likely to have very little impact as well. Why is that? Because 80% of the sugar that we produce here in this country is actually exported, and the 1% sugar that goes to sugary drinks would be traded elsewhere. So it's likely to have limited, if any, impact. But if we actually look at what happened in northern Queensland, we had a very big, thriving tobacco industry. And of course, people went up in arms when, oh my goodness, tobacco has now been demonised, and tobacco, the need for tobacco suddenly plummeted. And so during these times, people need to be resilient and they need to innovate. And what happened on those tobacco farms is that they replaced them with things like avocado, which we know is a healthy fat, and they replaced them with other fruits such as mango, which is a high sugar fruit. But they did actually replace the tobacco with those foods, and as a result, I understand, made an awful lot more money from those products than they ever did with tobacco. So, okay, if they're faced with having to pull up the sugarcane, then they will innovate and they will grow other things, and or perhaps use those sugar canes for things like ethanol, a clean fuel. There are other ways that sugar can be used. And so I think, to me, and particularly when 77% of Australians actually agree with a levy on sugar, it certainly is something that is gathers pretty widespread support.
I was listening to Dr. James Muecke, the cardiologist in England, and he was saying that in 50% of adults smoked, and we're now down to 17% of adults that are smoking. And he said, right at the moment, we have 50% of the diet, if not more, on ultra-processed foods, which is the carbohydrate foods. He said, we did it with tobacco, we can do it with food. But what scares me is like I said, I've been in this industry 40 years. I've tried to change the school tuck shop at my local school. I do everything I can to try to change things in my local community. But what I've learned in doing this is that it's at a grassroots level. It's about educating the people that as a doctor, your patients, now I want you to go on this low carb diet. Here's the evidence. This is the diet you need to do. Do you believe that even though the government is a slow-moving or a fast-moving train trying to turn around, that individuals can be like a jet ski and we can start to make some turns by starting at a grassroots level? Because that's, I guess, why I started the Nutrition Academy, is to start at a grassroots level, to teach the mother that then teaches the children, and then the children teach the children. So, how do we get our doctors who are a frontline in health to learn about what you want, obviously what you want to see happen? How are we going to do that? I know Gary wanted to do this. I know Gary, before he got gagged, wanted to do this. How do you see us changing our frontliners, who are our primary care practitioners, to change, on a grassroots level? Have you got some plans for those guys?
Well, I have this year. Not that I've been gagged. In fact, this is the year for me to be talking. And but COVID-19 has created a real gagging effect on my opportunities. So it's been difficult. But I have been speaking to groups of general practitioners. I'm giving an oration today at Flinders Medical Centre, a live one, fortunately. So I have been speaking quite a lot. I've been speaking to all the diabetes associations to raise awareness of some of the things that we've chatted about today. But I think, and I realise actually, so awareness, as I mentioned before, is one of these overarching strategies, and awareness and education of the Australian public, going all the way down to children at schools, but actually before that, to pregnant mothers, because we often metabolically set up people to have type 2 diabetes during pregnancy as well, and that's a whole other interesting story. But I think if we look at almost the root cause of this, which is our dietary guidelines, and the fact that, as I mentioned before, they're very powerful and they inform all these different groups. And so when, for example, you're saying to aged care facilities, oh, we need to change the diet, we can't continue to feed our elderly all of these carbs, which are making them fatter and sicker. Oh, but we're cooking by the Australian dietary guidelines. Or at our hospitals, what they're feeding patients in hospitals, and particularly patients who have just had their legs amputated. Carb-heavy diets, this is just brings tears to my eyes. So people don't want to go outside the guidelines. And we also have general practitioners and physicians, endocrinologists who, gee, if we go outside the guidelines, we'll be in trouble. Look what happened to poor Gary Fettkeep, we'll be in trouble. And so this is people are scared to go outside guidelines, because once you have guidelines, if you go outside the guidelines, you run the risk of being reprimanded or worse. And also the Dietary Association, there are dietitians who understand what we're talking about today, who've gone against and have been hauled up by their association, a non-regulated association, or a self-regulated association, I should say. So people are concerned. But I think the more of us that talk about it, and if we can actually change these guidelines so that people realise, if we can actually say, here's a national diabetes strategy, it's okay to talk about dietary methods to reverse type 2 diabetes, then GPs will be comfortable that they have the opportunity to address this, and to actually then find dietitians who understand it and believe in it and are practicing it.
Well, that sounds absolutely wonderful. And I'm very mindful of your time, and especially if you are speaking at Flinders. Is it Flinders University? You're speaking there today? Did you say live or not live?
Yeah, that's. I have a number of meetings. I've got a webinar at lunch, and then I have a live oration late this afternoon. So, I was going to be jet setting around the country giving live presentations, but they all dissolve once the pandemic struck. But I've been productive. I've used my time to seek out opportunities to give webinars, and thank you very much to the Nutrition Academy for the opportunity to speak as part of this podcast. So it's perhaps going to have more reach ultimately as a result of this.
Well, if we can help in any way with the dietary guidelines, these are mainly women. Most of my students are women, not all. We have men in there as well, but most of them are women. And they have resources for email. So if you have an email that you want sent out to a hospital, then and in that state, there's people, we're happy to do that for you. So we're behind you 100% with what you want to change. We're here to help in any way. And I really want to thank you for this wonderful hour of, your enlightenment, as well as everything that you've done for eyesight in Australia and around the world. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I've enjoyed being a part of it. And I think as Belinda Fettke says, we need to be noisy together. Be noisy with me, she says. And we do need to be noisy together about this. And the more people we can get speaking about it, the more organisations such as the Nutrition Academy, if we can rally all the troops together. And then, I've been thinking about having a petition and getting people to sign the petition, but we actually need organisations to get behind this and be a part of a bigger petition to to the government, to the NHMRC, to the Dietary Guidelines Review Panel to say things need to change. So let's hope. I've only got 2 months or so left of my role. I don't think I'm going to achieve everything I want to achieve in this role, but if we can get the dietary guidelines reviewed, if we can get reversal on the table, then I think I've had a successful year. So fingers crossed. Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll be, what is it? We'll be loud together or noisy together.
Be noisy together, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you too. See you, Cyndi. Bye-bye.